The Undertaker appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience on Spotify, talking for 2.5 hours about his various injuries, but it was the other 10 minutes that got people talking. Seriously, if you are into hip injuries and shoulder tears and pec tears and fractured orbital sockets, if you are maybe a medical student, then this is the interview for you. But we did learn in the midst of all of this injury talk, which seriously was 85% of this interview, we did learn that the pec tear that Undertaker suffered in early 2000. So let me give some background here. Undertaker was out with a groin injury. This was in the fall, right? Or maybe end of summer, early fall in 1999. This is when they took him out of that six-pack challenge main event in September at the Unforgiven pay-per-view. They replaced him with the British Bulldog. Triple H ended up winning the WWF title back. So they pulled Undertaker from the match because he was obviously in a lot of pain. He was having groin issues. I don't know if he was just rehabbing it or if he had surgery, but we didn't see him again until Judgment Day the following May, and that was when he returned as the American Badass and he debuted that new gimmick. Originally, he was due to come back in January, possibly at the Royal Rumble. That's what I had always heard. The plan was most likely, if he's coming back in January, it would be at the Rumble. The Rumble that year was at Madison Square Garden. And what we learned in this interview is that the pec tear that he suffered while he was in training, which is what delayed his return. He was about to come back. He was in the gym and he got hurt. And we never knew the details. And now we do. He was in the gym with Crush, Bryan Adams, who was one of his best friends. And Undertaker said that he was benching 485 pounds, feeling pretty good. Crush was supposed to be spotting him. He said Crush was something of a social butterfly, so he would socialize with people at the gym and he, chat them up a lot. So while he was supposed to be spotting the Undertaker, I guess maybe didn't realize that he was talking to somebody else, or he did, but he started benching anyway. And on the first rep goes fine. And on the second rep, as he's lifting this weight, he felt the muscle start to pull, like it was tugging and tugging and tugging, and then he could feel it in his chest. The muscle just tears. And now he's got 485 pounds sitting on his chest, and Crush is completely oblivious to this until he hears Undertaker, Brian, and then he turns and he rushes over, and Crush was a strong guy himself. He just picks it up with ease to get it off his chest. He says that kept him out for another 8 months, which is not true. He was back in 4. He was literally back in half that time. I know this because he worked some shows in Puerto Rico for Victor Quinones in December of 99. Him and Kane and maybe Godfather and some of the other WWF guys. I don't know if it was like a joint show or some kind of special show they were doing, for the promoter down there in Puerto Rico. It was a prior commitment. I think Savio Vega was involved. Savio is very good friends. He was part of the whole BSK group with The Undertaker. So he felt he has to keep his commitment. He worked the show and probably was in no condition to do so, but he did it anyway. So I know that he hadn't already suffered the pec tear by then. It had to be in January, and he was back by May. So the whole 8-month thing makes no sense. But in any event, I didn't know the circumstances around the pec tear, so that was cool to finally know the story behind that. But I do wonder, though, if Undertaker was supposed to come back, let's say he was going to make his big comeback at the Royal Rumble, okay? Would he have returned as the Dead Man, or would he have debuted as the American Badass? Now, that little short aisleway that year for the Rumble and MSG, he wouldn't have had a lot of room to ride a motorcycle down to the ring. But, look, Joe Rogan is not a wrestling fan. I'm not even sure why he had The Undertaker on. I've heard clips of Rogan before. He's very kind of flippant when it comes to wrestling. And in this interview, he was very respectful of Undertaker and wrestling and all that, but he's not a fan. I don't expect him to kind of dig into questions like this. But I would love to know if the gimmick change from the Dead Man to the American Badass only came about because he had all that extra time off after the pec tear. And that maybe is when he thought, okay, you know what? Maybe I need to change things up a little bit before I come back. Not a big deal, but I've always been curious about that. If he did not get hurt that second time and came back as originally scheduled, would we have ever seen the American Badass? I mean, probably at some point we would have. He did a pretty good job over the years of keeping that character fresh and trying to update it. But I don't know. I don't know that we would have necessarily gotten that new bandana-wearing, motorcycle-riding character that year when we did. But he also got into a bunch of other topics. By the way, in that new studio, it looks like Joe Rogan is doing his show from a spaceship. What is up with that new studio? Anyway, the subject of WWE drug testing in the early 90s came up. And all the reason why they started testing, because Joe Rogan wasn't even sure, why even bother having drug testing? What are they testing you guys for steroids for? He goes, if I were running the company, I would force everybody to be on steroids. Because you want to look big and strong, and it's not a real sport, and so that's kind of where he was coming from. But here's what Undertaker had to say about that, and hat tip on this to What Culture for the transcription. I watched the whole interview, but I didn't have time to transcribe all these parts word for word. So I'm just borrowing from part of their transcription here. But this is what The Undertaker had to say. They didn't want people getting popped, getting pulled over, and the cops finding weed in the car. So that would be a fine. You'd get fined a little bit this time. The second time you'd get fined a little more. The third time you'd get fined and maybe have to go to rehab. What they figured out, and what they still do when they took that away, what are you going to do? You're going to drink more. You're going to take more pills because you got to cope with the pain somehow. So then you've got guys overdosing. So everything has kind of led up to the drug protocol today. And that's the real shame of the 90s, when they wouldn't let guys smoke weed, when they did start to really crack down on that, or people worried that maybe they would lose their jobs or they would get fined and they wouldn't be able to pay all the fines. A lot of them turned to booze and pills. To them, that was the alternative. Well, if you're not going to let me smoke, then I've got to do something to kind of mask the pain. And alcohol was probably the most easily accessible substance. You throw pills in there and muscle relaxers and all that, and that is probably what led to a lot of the deaths that otherwise might not have happened. I mean, look, you are always going to have some people who are going to do all kinds of shit that they shouldn't be doing. You know, they're going to live that party lifestyle. They're going to be up until the wee hours at the bars and the clubs doing God knows what. But I'm sure there were guys who smoked in part to relieve the pain that they were constantly living in, especially bumping on those hard rings they had back then. Those rings were hard. They were like, a lot of the wrestlers described them like the old boxing rings. It was like falling on concrete. And if you go back and you watch some of those early to mid-90s WWF shows, like the early days even of Monday Night Raw, you go back and watch during those days and some of the slams and the superplexes, that ring doesn't move. It had like no give to it. So imagine with the crazy schedule they were running, which was even crazier than it is today, and having to bump on those rings night after night after night, it's no wonder a lot of those guys are so crippled up. Or have had all kinds of parts of their body replaced, knee replacements, hip replacements, and that they would have to turn to something to try to cope with that pain. It's not surprising. So what do? All of a sudden you can't do that. What do? You drink yourself to death, which is worse. And you start mixing in the muscle relaxers. And again, it's no wonder that a lot of those guys ended up getting hooked on that shit. But what got people talking, there were a couple of different parts of this interview. We'll tackle this first part here first. Were the comments that The Undertaker made about the locker room culture then, when he first broke into the business, as compared to today. This is what The Undertaker said. In that era of guys, those were men. You go into a dressing room nowadays, and it's a lot different. I remember walking into my first real dressing room, and all I saw were some crusty fucking men. Half of them had guns and knives in their bags. Shit got handled back then. Now you walk in, there's guys playing video games and making sure they look pretty. It's evolution, I guess. I don't know what it is. But I just like those eras, man. I liked when men were men. Missing the days when men were men and bemoaning today's wrestlers trying to look pretty when he used more eyeliner than most of the divas. L'Oreal stock plummeted 40% the day that The Undertaker retired. I made that first comment on Twitter, and people got so defensive. Oh, you should have seen the tweets that I got. Context. You gotta read the full quote. First of all, I don't have to read it. I watched it. I did watch the entire interview. Thank you very much. Thank you for the advice. I appreciate it. Second of all, I never offered my opinion. And this was the funniest thing of all. I never really gave my opinion one way or the other. I have a podcast on Sundays. That's why I wait until the podcasts, because sometimes 240 characters just isn't enough. And I figured this is a big enough topic. We've got to cover this on the show. But you put, a kind of a humorous little tweet out there, and people get so defensive. My God. Hey, here's a newsflash for those people. The Undertaker is not your friend. He's not your father. He's not your brother. He probably doesn't even know you exist, nor does he care. You don't have to feel the need to defend him. You're not his lawyer. I just found it funny that he would critique other wrestlers prettying themselves up when he used more makeup in his career than a Vegas showgirl. It's a generational thing. When Mark Calloway broke into the wrestling business, it was a very different business than it is today. I would not expect the locker rooms to be the same in 2021 as they were in 1991. Back then, guys were on the road, they were away from their families. If they wanted to talk to their wives, or their kids, or their mistresses, or whoever, they had to go find a payphone. There are people listening to this podcast who probably don't even know the concept of a payphone. But that's what you would have to do. People didn't have cell phones. You go back enough years, they didn't even have beepers. Remember those? I used to have a beeper. I thought it was fucking annoying. I got rid of it after a few weeks. I don't want people beeping me. But there were no cell phones. If you wanted to play video games, you know what you had to do back then? You had to wait until you got home to go play Duck Hunt. There were no laptops for you to sit there in the locker room when you were just trying to kill time and stream movies or do Zoom chats. If there were, guess what? Some of those guys would have been doing the exact same things that the wrestlers of today do. That and cocaine. Lines and lines and lines of cocaine, because it was the 80s and by all accounts, that's just the way it was. But times change. Technology changes. If social media existed back then, believe me, Twitter would have blocked half those guys the way they blocked the president. Half the WWF roster back then would have been blocked. Can you imagine some of the shit they would have posted? When it came to those late nights out, or politics, or religion, or whatever, oh my God. Believe me, they would have been on social media, they would have been doing all of the same things that the people do today. Now, a lot of wrestlers obviously took exception to the video game crack. There were a lot of passive-aggressive tweets this week from wrestlers directed, clearly, even if they didn't name him, clearly directed at The Undertaker. Xavier Woods, Austin Creed, being one of them. This is him on Twitter. He said, "I wouldn't be the person that I am without the guidance and lessons of a few key people from the previous generation of wrestling. They taught me about the business, to save my money, and that having video games in the locker room is healthier than having..." And then he writes, redacted, basically fill in the blank of all the horrible shit. Thank you, guys. So that was his tweet. The days when men were men, and they all died before the age of 45 when their hearts exploded. Ah, yes. Those were the good old days. Those were the good old days. I don't know about you guys, but I prefer my wrestlers alive, into their 50s. The video game crack I never understood. I never understood that. Undertaker is not the only one to bring it up. And look, I don't even think Undertaker necessarily brought it up in an insulting way here. But other veterans that have done interviews and have mentioned the whole video game thing, in other cases they have. And I've never understood that. You know, Undertaker and his BSK buddies, when they were in the locker room, I'm not talking when they were out, drinking Jack at all the strip clubs. And I've seen the photos of that. You probably saw some of the photos of that from years ago that got out. When Undertaker and his BSK friends, right? And Mabel was in there, I think. Rikishi, Farouk. Those are some famous photos of them at a strip club, women all over them and stuff. Which is fine. I don't know that they wanted those photos to get out. I still don't know who put those photos out on the internet. This was going back many years. But when they were and having fun and carousing after the shows, when they were in the locker room, based on all the stories, what did they do? What did Undertaker and his BSK buddies used to do in the back? They would play dominoes. 25 years ago, Undertaker and Henry Godwin and Savio Vega and Rikishi and Yokozuna, all these guys, they would sit around and they would play dominoes in the locker room. Other guys would play cards. Andre the Giant, he used to play cribbage. All these stories of him. There's always stories of Andre drinking and Andre playing cribbage. So today, guys play video games. What is the difference? A lot of the ones who play games play against each other, and they use that time to socialize, like the up, up, down, down stuff, if you ever watch any of that. So I just think anybody who uses the video game stuff is some sort of insult or some sort of way, like these guys, they don't talk to each other, they don't really hang out with each other the way that they used to. I don't think you can blame video games for that. I think that's a lame excuse. I think those people are just being ignorant. In Undertaker's case, he's the old guy who came up in a different era where things were different. I don't really think it's anything more than that. I think what raised some eyebrows in those comments was the whole when men were men thing. I didn't really get that either. You know, half the guys carried guns or knives in their bags. Sounds like a pretty shitty place to work if you feel the need to pack heat in your gym bag because you just don't know what might happen. If someone might try to pull something. But then again, after the Bruiser Brody incident, I don't know that I can say that I blame them. It felt, from listening to all the stories over the years of guys who came up in that era, it was more of the Wild West back then. You definitely had a much more, I think, interesting mix of personalities in terms of who was welcomed into the wrestling business, and there were a lot of unsavory characters. Look, you have unsavory characters today, but it feels like that was probably more of the case back then. And it was more of the Wild West. I don't see it as a bad thing if it's a little less like that today, with less of the hazing and less of the drugs, stuff like that. That being less of an issue than it would have been, let's say, 25 or 30 years ago in the wrestling business, to me, that's a good thing. That's not something to, lament, I miss the days of this and that. I'm happy as a fan. I'm happy that there's hopefully less of that today than there was back then. And I mentioned Xavier Woods in his tweet. It isn't lost on me that Xavier Woods has a PhD. And he has a successful gaming channel, and now he's doing a hosting gig on G4. He's got all of these other things going for him outside of just his wrestling career. And meanwhile, I'm listening to The Undertaker talk to Joe Rogan and say that he's not sure what he wants to do with his life. He's at this weird crossroads now where he's not that old. It's not like he's ready for the rocking chair in the retirement home. So he's not like... Maybe in wrestling standards, yeah, he's the old guy, but he's not really an old guy. He's not that old, but he doesn't know what he wants to do with his life. It's like he's done this for so long. Over 30 years of his life, he is dedicated to this, to being a performer, to being a professional wrestler. And now that it's over, and again, we'll see if it's over, but let's assume it's over, he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't have this whole... just wide array of different interests of things he might like to do. He talked about maybe having a hunting show on TV, because that was something Joe Rogan brought up. It wasn't something Undertaker brought up, but he claimed, yeah, I've thought about that, maybe, possibly. A lot of those guys, wrestling is all that they had. They didn't have anything to fall back on. A lot of those guys didn't go to college. They didn't get a degree. Some did. Some guys got out of the wrestling business and apparently did very well for themselves and have no interest in going back to the wrestling business. Rick Martel had this big comeback in WCW in 1997-98 and was doing really well, and then he suffered this catastrophic knee injury and was forced to retire, and I think he ended up in real estate. Now, I don't know if he went to college before he became a wrestler or if that's something he did after the fact, but he went off into the real estate business. Even Vader, I remember hearing Vader had real estate interests and stuff like that. So some guys do have that to kind of fall back on or jump into when their career is over. A lot of guys don't. And I would have to imagine that there is some resentment of the millennial generation. Vince McMahon himself on Steve Austin's podcast talked about those damn millennials, not in those words, but that's basically what he was saying, and how the locker room back in Stone Cold's day was different than it is today. And I think, if I remember, the comment he made was that they were more ambitious. They were more ambitious than the wrestlers are today. This is how they think. This is how they view the current generation of wrestlers. They lump them all in to this idea of the millennial generation, and they don't want it as badly as you do. They're not as ambitious as you were. Were they, though? Were they more ambitious back then? Or is it just harder for them to break through today? Or get their ideas through? Or they're too afraid to say anything? Just because of the way the system is structured now as compared to the way it would have been 20 or 30 years ago. Is part of that not also due to the way that the system and the organization in that company is put together? It's a very different company now. It's way more corporate now than it was back then. Publicly traded company now. They've got so many different departments and divisions, and they're constantly bringing in non-wrestling people from the outside to help run things. It's not like it was back then. And that has nothing to do with the talent. That's just how the company has grown and evolved over the years. But it goes to what I said about The Undertaker and his opinion of the locker rooms. It's just a different time. The WWF that he came into is very different than the WWE of today. We all get nostalgic about the glory days in our lives. But there's nothing wrong with wrestlers playing video games or streaming on Twitch. Unless you work for Vince McMahon. Then you're not allowed to do that anymore. That you can't do. But that wasn't all. Undertaker also had this to say about the current product, in his view, being soft. And I don't disagree with some of what he is saying here. He says, it's tough right now for me because the product has changed so much. It's kind of soft. And when Rogan asked if he'll get in trouble for saying that, Undertaker said, probably. I'll probably piss a lot of people off, but they need to hear it. It is what it is. To the young guys, oh, he's a bitter old guy. I'm not bitter. I did my time. I'm good. I walked away when I learned to walk away. I just think the product is a little soft. There's guys here and there that have an edge to them, but there's too much pretty and not enough substance. They're trying to put something out for everybody. Some guys are into the comedy shit. There's other guys that want to see the more hardcore type fighting. I think one of the biggest things that happened, we all got old at the same time. So there weren't enough guys to work with the young guys. You also have too many people that are, these guys on the internet say, I'm pretty fucking good. Okay, well, you can listen to them or you can listen to somebody who's been there and done it. There just was not enough merging of the young and the new talent. When we had Stone Cold and The Rock and Triple H and Shawn Michaels, we were all working together. We were all making money. We were drawing. Then we all just aged out. I hung in there for a long time, but we kind of aged out, and it left all these young guys to learn with more young guys, and the product changed. One person who disagrees with The Undertaker is the WWE Champion, Drew McIntyre, who told Sportskeeda, "I don't agree whatsoever, especially from an in-ring perspective. I've listened to part of it, I've got to listen to the whole thing, it's pretty new, but I think he may have been referring to the kind of storylines and characters like the co-host that was on the show. He was like a fan from the Attitude Era, and I think they were perhaps referring to some of the outlandish storylines. Back in the day, there were more sexual-based storylines, more risque, 18-plus type stuff. Our product now is PG. There's only so far we can push it, and we're willing to push it. There's certain things that from back in the day were awesome, and there's certain things that were not awesome that I would not want to go back to." So I'm not sure if it was from like that perspective when it comes to the stories and not being as adult-based as it used to be, but I think we're walking a good line right now. But when it comes to the in-ring game, that's just not true at all. It has never been more physical. So Drew admitted that he hadn't listened to the entire interview yet. That's not really what they were talking about. But I want to stay on this subject that McIntyre brought up about the in-ring product being as physical now as it's ever been. As a fan, watching on TV, I think he's right and I think he's wrong. When I watch WWE today, or I watch AEW today, this isn't a problem, I don't think, with a product like New Japan. Okay, I'm thinking WWE and AEW. Too often it feels like they're putting on a show. Which, yes, they are putting on a show. Not saying that. But it feels way too choreographed. And a lot of that are the flips and the dives. There's way too many fucking dives on television in these matches. But it's not just that. You know, when people ask me, what are, or who is your favorite wrestler of all time? I get that question sometimes from people like new listeners. Oh, do you have a favorite of all time? I say Bret Hart. And they say, why? And I have to explain to them why. I say that because when I watch a Bret Hart match, I never felt like I was watching a choreographed play. It felt like I was watching a battle between two people. And when he would take an ass kicking in a match, it really felt like he was getting the shit kicked out of him. The way he would sell a beating, and when he would fire back, I thought, he would throw one of the best working punches in wrestling. It felt like a fight. And sometimes it just depends who you're in the ring with, but I could think of some of the battles he had with Steve Austin, the brotherly battles he had with Owen Hart, people like Bam Bam Bigelow, some of the bigger guys maybe he was in the ring with, Kurt Hennig, right, when he was in there with Mr. Perfect. I think back to some of those matches, and it felt like a fight, and he wasn't working his matches trying to get a "this is awesome" chant, or to get some kind of fan chant like that, and that's the difference between then and now. So Drew is right, it may be more physical in that guys are taking more risks, they're doing more acrobatic stuff. You've got 300-pound guys like Keith Lee doing a fucking Spanish fly off the top rope. Now, Vader would do moonsaults off the top rope back in the day, but Vader was a rare breed. You didn't see that very often. Today, it's not so rare anymore. All the bigger guys feel like they have to do all the shit that the smaller guys do. So when we used to see cruiserweights in the WCW days or the early WWE days of the light heavyweight division, and they were flying all around the ring doing all this crazy stuff and ranas and everything else, you expected to see that from guys like that. You expected to see a Juventud Guerrera, a Billy Kidman, or Sean Waltman, or somebody like that doing stuff like that. You didn't expect to go out there and see Triple H flying around the ring like that. You didn't expect to see, Crush flying around the ring like that. And maybe they could have, but it just wouldn't have fit. You know what I mean? You didn't expect that. That the bigger guys had the bigger guy offense, and maybe they'd bust out a big move every now and then. And now I just feel like everybody feels like they have to all work the same. And you've got the bigger guys who are doing the dives out of the ring and doing all this wacky stuff. And I've said this before, if I were a lighter guy on the roster, if I were under 200 pounds, and that's how I have to work my matches to make me stand out more among the pack, I'm looking at a guy who's 275 pounds who's doing the same moves now that I'm doing, and I'm getting pissed. I'm like, dude, what are you doing here? You're kind of taking my moves away from me. I would have to think that in some cases that must go through their heads, but that's one of the biggest differences now that I see. You know, when I watch the in-ring product, you've got a lot of the bigger guys who are doing the acrobatic stuff. As the years have gone on, the danger has gone up because you constantly feel you have to innovate. You have to come up with new stuff to do, top what everybody before you did. The only thing more dangerous back then were the unprotected chair shots to the head. And the unprotected chair shots to the head, boy, they sounded great. But I don't miss when guys would just full-on bash each other in the head with a chair and scramble their brains. And it's funny that we talk about Undertaker here, because Undertaker has about 2 or 3 of the sickest unprotected chair shots that he's delivered that I've ever seen. The one to Ken Kennedy at Survivor Series, which was disgusting and completely uncalled for. The one to Chris Kanyon on SmackDown, which was also fucking just brutal. The one to Maven in the Royal Rumble in 2002 is the other one that I remember. Can't say that I miss those days. Made a great sound. Hey, it was a great visual, but it's a stupid thing to do. That's one of the few things I could think of. You know what? That was more dangerous back then. But today, you know, guys, they have to keep constantly, they feel like they have to up the game. And when you do that, you take more risks. And when you do that, there's a greater risk for injury and there's a greater margin for error. Every ladder match now, right? It's a constant game of, well, how do we top what we did last time? Everybody's seen so many ladder matches. How do we make this one different? How do we make this one stand out? What new convoluted spot can we come up with that might look really cool, but it's not something you would ever see in a fight between 2 people who are trying to hurt each other and who are trying to win a match? They're trying to pop the audience. They're trying to pop the crowd. So I think Drew is right and he's wrong. I wish WWE and AEW had more of that real feel to it, like a lot of those old school matches did, and less of the, oh, hey, let's throw 15,000 super kicks and make sure that we're in the right spot to, you know, catch Tweedledum on this dive that I'm going to get right back up from anyway 5 seconds later. See, now I sound like the old man in the room, but I think there's a lot of validity to what I'm saying. Undertaker is right. There is too much pretty and not enough substance when it comes to what you see on screen, what you see in the ring. I don't think you can lay all of that, though, at the feet of the talent. The company is responsible almost as much. I mean, even the look of the show itself is too pretty. Eric Bischoff said this on a recent podcast not too long ago. The WWE product visually looks too polished. You would think, boy, the product has never looked better. It's HD. Now I noticed the last couple of weeks on TV, they're using these 8K cameras when guys come out to make their entrance. And that looks pretty cool. All the lighting, the LED lights, the Thunderdome, like the whole presentation is almost too polished for their own good. It would benefit them being a little bit darker and being a little bit more gritty, like they used to be many years ago. You got that. You've got the micromanaging of the talent that we hear about from people who have worked there. The overly scripted nature of the promos, which I don't need anybody to tell me about that because I hear it with my own 2 fucking ears every single week I watch TV. The promos have never been worse in WWE. You can tell the difference between a product like WWE and AEW when it comes to the promos. And not everybody in AEW is a good promo. But I at least appreciate the fact that when I hear them speak in a lot of these interviews, it doesn't sound as forced or as rehearsed or as hokey as a lot of the stuff does in WWE, where you almost feel like they're just trying to make sure we've got our lines memorized. Let's make sure we just say them without fucking up. It's never been worse in that company right now. So those are all very big issues, I think, that have to be addressed. But the biggest problem of all, more than anything else that I just mentioned, is bad creative. Undertaker didn't say this, but I will. A lot of their shows, mainly on Mondays, are unwatchable. Unwatchable. When Undertaker, he was trying to be nice about it when do you watch the product now? Do you follow it? He's like, not really. How could he? How could he? It sucks. I don't blame him. He could just come out and say no. But he would offend too many people. He's friendly with people who work in the company and Triple H and all that, so I get it. He's got to measure his words and be careful with what he says. I don't have that issue. So I just say what I feel. I don't have to worry about any of that. It sucks. Plain and simple. Monday Night Raw is the worst wrestling show on television every single week, and it's not even close. Not even close. And guess what? That's less of a talent issue, and that's more of a WWE issue. The shows just are not fun. People want to have fun. Undertaker doesn't have to sit there and feel guilty that he and all the other vets, we got too old, we aged out before we had the ability to work with these young kids and help them along. He doesn't have to feel guilty about that. Because with the writing on these shows, it would have made no difference. Not even The Undertaker and Stone Cold in their prime could make some of these shows tolerable. Because The Undertaker and Stone Cold would not be allowed to be The Undertaker and Stone Cold that we all remember if they were coming up in today's climate. It would not be possible. They would try to make it work, but it wouldn't be the same. Because the company and the way that they produce their shows and just do things is different than it was back then. But that problem starts and stops with one man. And we all know who that man is. Buried in all of this is the really big news, which is that The Undertaker is thinking about calling Diamond Dallas Page to try DDP yoga. I didn't expect to hear that. Joe Rogan was putting over DDP. He was putting him over something fierce because he's had DDP on the show before. He's probably seen the video on Arthur, which is a tremendously inspirational video. It's a great marketing tool. I don't see how you can not watch that video and want to just jump right into doing DDP yoga. So Rogan was singing his praises and how he's helped other wrestlers before and stuff. And Undertaker was like, oh yeah, and I've thought about it. I thought about picking up the phone and calling him. I think he said his wife even told him that you should call Dallas and stuff. And I can only hope, if he does, that this time he doesn't have his wife beat the crap out of DDP. At least Michelle was a wrestler, unlike Sarah. Sarah was not a wrestler. Remember little Sarah Undertaker beating the hell out of DDP on TV? He was never the same. I hope things work out better for him this time. But now I've got to see this video. I've got to see these two come together. That's what I need to see. I need to see an Undertaker video doing DDP yoga. I never thought I would live to see the day, but we might get it. It might actually happen.